Thomas never thought he'd end up spending his nights watching over an empty house in the middle of nowhere. But life has a funny way of pushing you toward places you never imagined you'd be. 3 years ago, he was just another construction worker, trying to make ends meet. He had a wife, a small apartment in town, and steady work building houses for families who dreamed of something better. Then everything fell apart at once, like dominoes tumbling in slow motion. First the construction company where he'd worked for 8 years suddenly shut down. The owner had been gambling with the business money, and one day they all showed up to find a notice on the door saying the company was bankrupt. Thomas stood there with his toolbox in hand, watching his coworkers shake their heads and walk away. Just like that, his steady paycheck was gone. His marriage couldn't handle the stress. When the bills started piling up and Thomas couldn't find another job right away, his wife became distant. She'd always been the type who needed security, and watching their savings disappear made her panic. The fights started small but grew bigger each week. She'd accuse him of not trying hard enough, and he'd snap back that he was doing everything he could. Finally, she packed her bags and moved in with her sister, leaving behind only a note saying she needed space to think. Thomas spent the next few months applying for jobs, living on unemployment benefits and feeling like a failure. The construction industry in their small town had dried up, and he was competing with dozens of other workers for the few jobs available. He'd sit in his empty apartment, listening to the silence where his wife's voice used to be, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. That's when he saw the advertisement in the local newspaper. A property management company was looking for a night caretaker for a remote homestead. The job was simple: show up at sunset, patrol the property, and make sure nobody broke in or damaged anything. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and the isolation actually sounded appealing after months of rejection letters and awkward conversations with people who pitied him. The Morrison homestead was 15 miles outside of town, down a winding dirt road that most people had forgotten existed. The first time Thomas drove up to the property, he understood why it had been abandoned. The house was massive but clearly old, with paint peeling from its wooden sideboards and shutters hanging crooked on their hinges. It sat in the middle of 40 acres of overgrown fields, surrounded by oak trees that had been growing there longer than anyone could remember. The property management company explained that the Morrison family had owned the land for over a century, but the last surviving member had died 5 years ago. The house had been on the market ever since, but buyers were scared off by how remote it was and how much work it needed. In the meantime, they needed someone to make sure teenagers didn't break in to party or that copper thieves didn't strip the old pipes from the basement. Thomas's job was straightforward. Every evening at sunset, he'd drive out to the property, park his old pickup truck near the front porch, and begin his routine. He'd walk the entire perimeter of the house, checking every window and door to make sure they were still locked. Then he'd circle the old barn, the storage shed, and the well house, looking for any signs that someone had been there during the day. After his patrol, he'd settle into an old wooden chair on the wraparound porch. The property management company had told him he could bring a small space heater for cold nights, and he'd bought a good thermos to keep his coffee warm. Most nights he'd read paperback novels he picked up at the thrift store, losing himself in stories about other people's adventures while he listened to the sounds of the countryside. The first few weeks were the hardest. Thomas had lived in town his whole life, and the complete silence of the homestead felt overwhelming. There were no car horns, no neighbors talking, no television sounds drifting through apartment walls. Just wind through the trees, the occasional owl calling to its mate, and the settling sounds of an old house cooling down after a warm day. But slowly, Thomas began to find comfort in the routine. He started to recognize the different sounds the house made. The front door creaked in a specific way when the wind pushed against it. The loose board on the porch steps made a distinctive squeak when he stepped on it. The old barn door would bang gently against its frame when storms were coming. He learned to read the weather by watching the sky. Clear nights meant he could see stars like he'd never noticed in town, where streetlights washed out most of the darkness. Cloudy nights brought different sounds as the wind picked up and rain began to fall on the tin roof of the barn. Thomas found himself looking forward to both kinds of weather, each offering its own kind of peace. During his walks around the property, Thomas began to notice details he'd missed at first. Wild blackberry bush grew along the fence line, and deer paths crisscrossed the overgrown fields. An old vegetable garden behind the house still showed signs of rows where someone had once grown tomatoes and corn. The well house contained an old hand pump that still worked, bringing up cold, clean water from deep underground. The loneliness that had felt crushing in his empty apartment began to feel different here. In town, being alone had reminded him of what he'd lost. Out here, solitude felt like a choice rather than a punishment. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was just taking a break from it. Thomas started bringing different books to read, exploring genres he'd never tried before. He read mysteries that kept him guessing until the last page, historical novels that transported him to different times and places, and even some poetry that he'd never understood before but somehow made more sense under the stars, on particularly quiet nights. He'd set his book aside and just listen. The sounds of the countryside told their own stories. He could hear families of raccoons chittering to each other as they explored the area around the barn. Owls would call and answer each other from different trees, carrying on conversations he couldn't understand but somehow found soothing. Sometimes a fox would bark in the distance, a sharp sound that would make him look up from his reading. The seasons changed around him, and Thomas began to understand the rhythm of the land in a way he'd never experienced in town. Spring brought new sounds as birds returned from their winter homes. Summer nights were filled with the chorus of insects and the rustle of leaves heavy with humidity. Fall arrived with the sound of acorns dropping on the roof and the calls of geese passing overhead. Winter brought a different kind of quiet, with snow muffling all sounds except the crack of tree branches adjusting to the cold. Thomas realized he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. The job that had seemed like a last resort had become a refuge. The house that had looked abandoned and sad had become a place of comfort. The isolation that had worried him had become a source of strength. Every evening, as he settled into his chair with his coffee and book, Thomas felt a sense of purpose he'd lost when his old life fell apart. He was protecting something, keeping watch over a piece of history, making sure this old homestead would be ready for whatever came next. He had no idea that on one particular October night, what came next would change everything he thought he knew about his future. October had always been Thomas's favorite month at the homestead. The air turned crisp and clean, carrying the smell of dying leaves and the promise of winter. The old oak trees around the property blazed with colors that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and the silence felt deeper somehow, as if the world was settling down for a long rest. But this particular October night felt different from the moment Thomas arrived. The sky was heavy with storm clouds that had been building all day, blocking out the stars he'd grown accustomed to seeing. The wind was stronger than usual, making the old house creak and groan in ways that sounded almost like voices having a conversation he couldn't quite understand. Thomas went through his usual routine, walking the perimeter of the property with his flashlight, checking every window and door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar sights that had become as comfortable as his own reflection. Everything looked normal, but something in the air made him feel restless, like the atmosphere before a big thunderstorm. When even the animals sensed that change is coming, he settled into his chair on the porch, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold wind. The space heater hummed quietly beside him, creating a small circle of warmth in the chilly night. He'd brought along a mystery novel about a detective solving crimes in a small town, thinking it would be perfect for a night like this, but as he tried to read, the words seemed to blur together, and he found himself looking up at the dark fields more often than usual. The storm was definitely coming. Thomas could smell it in the air, that distinct scent of rain and electricity that made his skin feel charged. Thunder rumbled in the distance, still far away but getting closer. He'd weathered plenty of storms at the homestead, and they'd never bothered him before. If anything, he enjoyed the drama of nature putting on a show while he sat safe and dry on the covered porch. It was just after 10 o'clock when Thomas heard something that made him set his book down completely. At first, he thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer moving through the overgrown fields. But as he listened more carefully, he realized the sound was too regular, too purposeful. It was footsteps, definitely human footsteps, crunching on the gravel road that led to the homestead. Thomas felt his heart rate pick up. In 3 years of working at the property, he'd never had an unexpected visitor. A few times, teenagers had, driven by slowly, probably looking for a place to party, but they'd always moved on when they saw his truck parked in the driveway. Once, a lost driver had knocked on the door asking for directions, but that had been during his first week on the job, and it had happened in the early evening, not in the middle of the night. He stood up slowly, switching off the space heater, and moving to the edge of the porch where he could see the road better. The footsteps were getting closer, and now he could hear something else, the sound of wheels rolling over gravel, like someone pulling a suitcase behind them. Thomas grabbed his flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. He wanted to see who was coming before they saw him. A figure emerged from the darkness, walking steadily toward the house. Even in the dim light, Thomas could tell it was a woman, probably. In her 30s, wearing a long coat that looked too thin for the cold night. She was pulling a small suitcase behind her, the kind people take on short trips, and she moved with the determined gait of someone who had a specific destination in mind. As she got closer, Thomas could see that she looked exhausted. Her hair was disheveled, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if she was worried about being followed. When she reached the bottom of the porch steps, she stopped and looked up at Thomas, who was still standing in the shadows. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice shaky but polite. "I know it's late, but I really need help." Thomas stepped into the light, and the woman visibly relaxed when she saw his face. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and work-worn hands, clearly not someone who posed a threat. Thomas felt cautious. No one was supposed to be here, and the nearest house was miles away. How had she even found this place? "My car broke down about 2 miles back," she continued, setting down her suitcase and wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "I've been walking for almost an hour, and I saw your light from the road. My phone died, and I don't know what else to do." Thomas studied her face in the porch light. She looked genuinely distressed, not like someone who was trying to trick him or cause trouble. Her eyes were red-rimmed, either from crying or exhaustion, and she was shivering despite her coat. Something about her reminded him of a lost animal. The way she kept looking around nervously while trying to appear calm. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently, stepping down from the porch but keeping some distance between them. "Elena," she replied. "Elena Rodriguez. I'm traveling to the city for a new job, and my car just died on me. I'm not from around here, so I don't know anyone, and I don't have money for a hotel even if I could find one out here." Thomas nodded, processing her story. The road that passed by the homestead was rarely used, especially at night. Most people took the main highway to get to the city, which was faster and better lit, but someone who was trying to avoid main roads might choose this route, especially if they had reasons for not wanting to be easily found. "Why are you traveling so late?" Thomas asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. Elena hesitated, and Thomas saw something flicker across her face, a kind of fear that went deeper than just being stranded with a broken car. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more vulnerable. "I had to leave tonight," she said. "I couldn't wait until morning. My ex-husband ... She trailed off, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, you don't need to hear about my problems. I just need to use a phone to call for help." Thomas felt a familiar pang in his chest. He recognized that tone, the way someone sounds when they're trying to escape from a situation that's become unbearable. He'd heard it in his own voice during the worst parts of his marriage, when he'd wanted to run away but hadn't known where to go. The wind picked up suddenly, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Elena looked up at the sky, and Thomas saw genuine panic cross her face. She was clearly at the end of her rope, standing in the middle of nowhere with a storm approaching and no idea what to do next. "Look," Thomas said, making a decision that surprised him. "I'm just the night watchman here. This isn't my house and I'm not supposed to let anyone inside, but I've got a phone in my truck and you're welcome to use it." Elena's face lit up with relief. "Thank you so much. I promise I won't cause any trouble. I just need to call a tow truck and maybe a taxi to get me to town." Thomas walked over to his pickup truck and retrieved his cell phone from the dashboard. As he handed it to Elena, he noticed that her hands were shaking and not just from the cold. Whatever had made her leave her home in the middle of the night had clearly been serious. Elena tried several numbers, but each call ended in disappointment. The tow truck services were either closed for the night or couldn't come out until morning. The taxi company told her they didn't service the rural roads, especially not in bad weather. With each failed call, she looked more defeated. "I'm sorry," she said, handing the phone back to Thomas. "I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't go back, and I can't stay here." The rain was falling harder now, and lightning flickered in the distance. Thomas looked at Elena, standing there in her thin coat with her small suitcase, and made another decision that would change both their lives forever. "You can wait inside until morning," he said. "I'll take responsibility for it. There's a couch and I can make some coffee. We'll figure out what to do when the sun comes up." Elena stared at him for a moment, as if she couldn't believe someone would show such kindness to a stranger. Then tears started rolling down her cheeks and she whispered, "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me." As Thomas unlocked the front door of the old homestead, he had no idea that he was opening the door to a future he'd never imagined possible. The inside of the old homestead was nothing like Elena had expected. From the outside, the house looked abandoned and slightly creepy, but as Thomas switched on the lights, she saw that someone had been taking care of it. The wooden floors were clean and polished, the windows were spotless, and even though the furniture was old, everything was neat and organized. "The property management company has someone come in once a week to dust and vacuum," Thomas explained, noticing Elena looking around with surprise. "They want to keep it ready in case a buyer finally shows up." Elena set her suitcase down near the front door and unwrapped her thin coat. Underneath, she wore scrubs, the kind that nurses and medical workers use. They were wrinkled and looked like she'd been wearing them for hours, maybe even days. Thomas pretended not to notice, but he filed the information away in his mind. Healthcare. Workers often worked long shifts, and if she was traveling to a new job, she might be a nurse or something similar. "I'll put on some coffee," Thomas said, heading toward the kitchen. "The couch in the living room is pretty comfortable. I've fallen asleep on it myself a few times during slow nights." Elena followed him into the kitchen, which was surprisingly modern despite the house's age. Someone had updated the appliances at some point, probably hoping to make the property more appealing to buyers. Thomas moved around the space with familiarity, clearly comfortable in what was supposed to be an empty house. "You spend a lot of time here," Elena observed, watching him measure coffee grounds into an old-fashioned percolator. 3 years, Thomas replied. "At first, I just sat on the porch and read books. But after a while, I started exploring the house, making sure everything was working properly. The company doesn't mind, as long as I'm here doing my job." As the coffee began to brew, the storm outside intensified. Rain pelted against the windows, and thunder rolled overhead with increasing frequency. Elena jumped slightly at a particularly loud clap of thunder, and Thomas noticed her reaction. "Big storms can be scary out here," he said gently, "but this house has weathered a lot worse. It's been standing for over 100 years. Elena nodded, but Thomas could see that her nervousness wasn't really about the weather. She kept glancing toward the windows as if she was worried about something outside besides the storm. Her hands shook slightly as she accepted the cup of coffee he offered her. They settled into the living room, Elena on the couch and Thomas in an armchair across from her. The coffee was strong and hot, and the warmth seemed to help Elena relax a little. She wrapped her hands around the mug and took a deep breath. "I should explain why I'm really here," she said quietly. You've been so kind to me, and you deserve to know the truth. Thomas waited patiently, sensing that whatever she was about to tell him had been weighing on her heavily. I'm a nurse, Elena began, confirming Thomas's earlier guess. I work at a hospital in Columbus, or I did until yesterday. I've been there for 6 years, and I love my job. I love helping people, being there when they need someone the most. She paused, staring into her coffee cup as if searching for the right words. But my personal life has been a nightmare for the past 3 years. I married my husband 5 years ago, and at first everything seemed perfect. He was charming, attentive, and he made me feel like the most important person in the world. But slowly, things started to change. Thomas had heard stories like this before. His sister had gone through something similar with her first husband, and he recognized the pattern Elena was describing. It started with small things, Elena continued. He'd get jealous when I talked to male colleagues at work. He'd question why I needed to go out with friends. He said he just loved me so much that he couldn't stand the thought of sharing me with anyone else. I thought it was romantic at first. She took a sip of coffee, and Thomas could see her gathering courage to continue. Then it got worse. He started checking my phone, following me to work, showing up at the hospital during my shifts to surprise me. My friends started avoiding me because he made them uncomfortable. My family tried to talk to me about it, but I defended him. I thought if I just tried harder, if I was a better wife, things would get better. Thomas felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. He'd seen what controlling behavior could do to good people, how it could make them doubt themselves and accept treatment they never should have tolerated. What made you finally decide to leave? Thomas asked gently. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she continued talking. Last week, I came home from a double shift at the hospital. I was exhausted, and I'd missed several of his calls because I was with patients. He accused me of having an affair with one of the doctors. When I tried to explain that I'd been saving someone's life, She paused, touching her cheek unconsciously. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He didn't need her to spell it out. That's when I knew I had to get out, Elena said. I'd been making excuses for him for so long, telling myself that he was just stressed or that I was overreacting. But when I saw the fear in my own eyes in the mirror, I realized I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. She explained how she'd been secretly saving money for months, hiding small amounts from each paycheck in a separate account her husband didn't know about. She'd applied for jobs in different cities, using her friend's address so the responses wouldn't come to her house. When she finally got an offer for a nursing position in a city 200 miles away, she knew it was her chance. I was supposed to start driving this morning, Elena said. But yesterday, he went through my purse and found the letter from the hospital. He figured out what I was planning. The fight was really bad. I was scared of what he might do, so I waited until he fell asleep, packed one bag, and left. Thomas understood now why she'd been traveling at night, why she'd chosen back roads instead of the main highway. She wasn't just starting a new job, she was running for her life. I've been driving for 6 hours, Elena continued. I was trying to get as far away as possible before morning when he'd wake up and realize I was gone. Then my car just died. I don't know anything about cars, and I don't have money for major repairs. I used most of my savings for the security deposit on an apartment in the city. Thomas felt a deep respect for Elena's courage. Leaving an abusive relationship was one of the hardest things anyone could do, and she'd done it with almost no resources and no support system. What's your plan when you get to the city? Thomas asked. Elena's face brightened slightly. I start work at the hospital next Monday. It's a good job, better pay than I was making before. I found a small apartment in a safe neighborhood, and I'll be able to start over completely. No one there knows about my past, and I can just focus on being a good nurse again. As she talked about her future, Thomas saw a different person emerging. The frightened, exhausted woman who'd knocked on his door was still there, but underneath was someone strong and determined. She'd made an incredibly difficult decision and was following through with it, even when everything seemed to be going wrong. What about you? Elena asked suddenly. What's your story? How did you end up as a night watchman in the middle of nowhere? Thomas was surprised by the question. He'd become so focused on Elena's situation that he'd forgotten they were having a conversation, not just him listening to her troubles. It had been a long time since anyone had asked about his life with genuine interest. He found himself telling Elena about his marriage, his job loss, and how he'd ended up at the homestead. As he talked, he realized he was sharing details he'd never told anyone else, not even his sister. There was something about Elena's honesty that made him want to be equally open. I thought my life was over when everything fell apart, Thomas admitted. But working here has taught me that sometimes. What feels like an ending is actually a beginning. I've learned to appreciate things I never noticed before, like how quiet the world can be or how beautiful the stars look when there's no city lights blocking them. Elena smiled, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her all night. It sounds like you found peace here. I have, Thomas said, realizing it was true. I didn't know I was looking for it, but I found it. They talked until dawn, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, and their fears. Thomas learned that Elena loved to garden, but had never had space for one. Elena discovered that Thomas had always wanted to travel, but had never found the right time or person to travel with. They found they both loved reading old movies, and the idea of living somewhere quiet where they could hear themselves think. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas realized something had changed. The loneliness he'd grown comfortable with felt different now, like a space that had been waiting to be filled. And Elena, who had arrived as a frightened stranger, now felt like someone he'd known for years. When the tow truck finally arrived, just after 7 in the morning, Elena seemed reluctant to leave. She lingered on the porch, looking back at the house and at Thomas, as if she was trying to memorize the moment. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. You saved my life. Tonight, and I don't just mean from the storm." 3 weeks passed after Elena left with the tow truck, and Thomas found himself thinking about her more than he expected. Every night when he settled into his chair on the porch, he'd remember their conversation, the way she'd looked so relieved. When he offered to help, and how natural it had felt to talk with someone who truly listened. He'd gone back to his normal routine of reading books and walking the property. But something felt different. The solitude that had once been healing now felt incomplete, like a song missing its harmony. Thomas caught himself looking down the gravel road more often, half hoping to see someone walking toward the house. Though he knew that was impossible, the October weather had turned colder, and the leaves on the old oak trees were beginning to fall, creating a carpet of red and gold around the homestead. Thomas had always enjoyed this time of year, but now it reminded him of that stormy night when everything had changed. He wondered if Elena had made it to her new job, if she was safe in her new apartment, if she ever thought about the strange night she'd spent with a lonely watchman. Then, on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was setting, Thomas heard the sound of a car engine coming down the gravel road. He looked up from his book, expecting to see a lost driver or maybe someone from the property management company. Instead, he saw a small blue car that he didn't recognize pulling into the driveway. The car door opened, and Elena stepped out. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. She looked completely different from the frightened, exhausted woman who had knocked on his door 3 weeks ago. Her hair was styled, she wore a nice dress instead of wrinkled scrubs, and she moved with confidence rather than fear. But it was definitely her, as she was smiling as she walked toward the porch. "I was hoping you'd be here," Elena called out, climbing the porch steps. "I wasn't sure what your schedule was like." Thomas stood up, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his work clothes and the simple life he'd been living. Elena looked like she belonged in the city, professional and put together, while he was just a night watchman reading paperback novels in the middle of nowhere. "Elena," he said, trying to hide his surprise. "You look ... great. How did everything work out with your new job?" "Better than I hoped," she replied, settling into the chair next to his as if no time had passed at all. The hospital is wonderful, my coworkers are kind, and my apartment is perfect. Small, but it's mine, and I feel safe there. Thomas felt genuinely happy for her, but also confused. If everything was going so well, why had she driven all the way back to visit him? That's wonderful, he said. I'm really glad things worked. Out. Elena nodded, but then her expression became more serious. Thomas, I need to tell you something. I haven't been able to stop thinking about that night. Not because it was traumatic, but because it was the first time in years that I felt like myself again. Sitting here, talking with you, I remembered who I used to be before everything went wrong. Thomas felt warmth spreading through his chest. He'd felt the same way, but he'd assumed it was just because he'd been alone for so long that any human connection would feel significant. I felt that, too, he admitted. But I figured it was just because I don't talk to people very often out here. Elena shook her head. No, it was more than that. You listened to me without judging. You helped me without expecting anything in return. You made me feel like I mattered as a person, not just as someone who needed to be rescued. She paused, looking out at the fields that were turning golden in the evening light. The thing is, Thomas, I love my new job, but I hate living in the city. I grew up in a small town, and I'd forgotten how much I missed having space to breathe. Being able to see the stars at night, hearing birds instead of traffic. Thomas wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but he sensed that Elena had something important to say. I've been doing some research, Elena continued, reaching into her purse and pulling out a folder. I looked up this property, the Morrison Homestead. Did you know it's been on the market for 5 years? Thomas nodded. The property management company told me. They can't find anyone who wants to live this far from town. That's exactly why I'm here, Elena said, opening the folder. I've been thinking about this for 3 weeks, and I have an idea. What if someone bought this place who actually wanted to live away from everything? Someone who could appreciate what it has to offer instead of seeing it as a problem. Thomas stared at her, beginning to understand what she was suggesting. Elena, this place needs a lot of work. The roof leaks, the plumbing is old, and the heating system barely works. That's why it's been sitting empty for so long. I know, Elena said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. That's why I think we could get it for much less than its appraised value. The owners just want it off their hands. We? Thomas asked, feeling his pulse quicken. Elena leaned forward, her voice full of enthusiasm. Thomas, I've been saving money. For years. I have enough for a down payment, and with my nursing salary I could qualify for a mortgage. But I don't know anything about fixing up an old house. You do. You've been in construction. You know what needs to be done. Thomas felt dizzy. Elena was proposing something he'd never even allowed himself to dream about. You're talking about buying this place? He asked, wanting to make sure he understood correctly. I'm talking about us buying this place, Elena corrected. As partners. I provide the money and the steady income, you provide the skills and knowledge to fix it up. We could turn it into something amazing. Thomas stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the land he'd grown to love. The idea was incredible, but it also seemed impossible. Elena, you barely know me, he said. We spent one night talking. That's not enough to base a major life decision on, isn't it? Elena asked, standing up and joining him at the porch railing. In one night, you showed me more kindness than I'd experienced in years. You're honest, you're hardworking, and you're not afraid of solitude. Those are exactly the qualities I'd want in a partner for something like this. Thomas felt torn between excitement and caution. The rational part of his mind was listing all the reasons why this was a crazy idea. But another part, the part that had been slowly dying during his years of isolation, was coming back to life. What would we do with it? He asked. I mean, if we actually bought it? Elena's face lit up. I've been thinking about that too. Look at this place, Thomas. It's beautiful, it's peaceful, and it's only an hour from the city. People would pay good money to stay somewhere like this for weekends or vacations. We could turn it into a bed and breakfast. Thomas considered this. He'd seen similar places advertised in magazines, rural retreats where city people could escape the stress of urban life. The idea had merit. I could keep working at the hospital, Elena continued. At least at first, until we got established. And you could work on the renovations during the day, then we could host guests on weekends. What about your ex-husband? Thomas asked. Would you be safe living out here? Elena's expression grew serious. I've been thinking about that too. He doesn't know about this place, and he'd never think to look for me here. Besides, I won't be alone. I'd have you, and we'd have guests coming and going regularly. It would actually be safer than living by myself in the city. Thomas walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. The idea was overwhelming, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He'd been happy at the homestead, but he'd also been lonely. Elena had found success in the city, but she was clearly unhappy there. Together they might be able to create something that neither could achieve alone. How would the partnership work? He asked. I mean, legally and financially? Elena sat back down and pulled out more papers from her folder. I've already talked to a lawyer about that. We'd form a business partnership with both our names on the deed. I'd handle the mortgage payments and business expenses. You'd handle the renovation work and day-to-day maintenance. Any profits would be split equally. Thomas was amazed by how thoroughly Elena had thought this through. She'd clearly spent the past 3 weeks researching every aspect of the plan. And if it doesn't work out? Thomas asked. If we find out we can't stand each other after a few months? Then we sell the place and split whatever we get, Elena said simply. But Thomas, I don't think that's going to happen. We're both at points in our lives where we need something new, something meaningful. This could be exactly what we're both looking for. Thomas looked at Elena, seeing the hope and determination in her eyes. He thought about his empty apartment. In town, his failed marriage, and the years he'd spent just drifting through life. Then he thought about the peace he'd found at the homestead, the satisfaction he'd felt in taking care of the property, and the connection he'd experienced with Elena during their long night of conversation. When would we need to make a decision? He asked. The real estate agent thinks we could close within a month if we move quickly, Elena replied. But Thomas, I need to know that you're really interested before I make an offer. This isn't just about buying a house. It's about building a life together as partners and friends. Thomas stood up again, walking to the other side of the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and the old homestead looked more beautiful than ever in the golden light. He thought about 6 months later, Thomas stood on the same porch where his life had changed forever, but everything around him was completely different. The old homestead still looked like the same house from the outside, but now it felt alive again, filled with purpose and possibility. The transformation had been incredible to witness. What started as Elena's crazy idea had become the most rewarding project either of them had ever undertaken. The house that had sat empty for years was now a warm, welcoming home that regularly hosted guests from the city who came seeking the peace and quiet that Thomas had discovered years ago. Thomas had thrown himself into the renovation work with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt since his construction days. The first month had been the hardest. Elena had quit her job at the city hospital and moved into the homestead while Thomas worked on making it livable. They'd lived like campers at first, sleeping on air mattresses and cooking on a camp stove while Thomas rewired the electrical system and fixed the plumbing every morning. Thomas would wake up before dawn and start working on whatever project was most urgent. He'd replaced the old roof that had leaked for years, installed new windows that actually kept the cold out, and updated the heating system so the house stayed warm even on the coldest winter nights. Elena would work alongside him whenever she could, learning skills she'd never needed in her previous life. "Hand me that wrench," Elena would say, her hair tied back in a bandana, her hands dirty from helping Thomas install new kitchen cabinets. She'd traded her nurse scrubs for work clothes and seemed to enjoy the physical labor as much as Thomas did. The best part had been discovering that their partnership worked even better than they'd hoped. Thomas was methodical and careful, planning each project thoroughly before starting. Elena was more spontaneous and creative, coming up with ideas that Thomas never would have considered. Together, they made decisions faster and better than either could have alone. What if we knocked out this wall? Elena had suggested one morning, pointing to a barrier between the kitchen and dining room. It would make the space feel bigger and more open. Thomas had studied the wall, checking for electrical wires and structural support. It's not load-bearing, he'd concluded. We could do that. 3 days later, they had an open-concept living space that made the old house feel twice as large. Elena had been right about the improvement, and Thomas had been able to make it happen safely and efficiently. They'd learned to appreciate each other's strengths. Elena had an eye for design and color that transformed each room from merely functional to genuinely beautiful. She'd painted the walls in warm, welcoming colors, arranged furniture in ways that made every space feel comfortable and added personal touches that made the house feel like a real home. Thomas had contributed his practical knowledge and attention to detail. Every repair was done properly, every improvement was built to last, and every safety concern was addressed before they moved on to the next project. Elena often joked that Thomas could fix anything, but he knew that her encouragement and partnership made him want to do his best work. By spring, they'd been ready to welcome their first guests. Elena had designed a simple website, taken beautiful photos of the renovated house, and created a reservation system. Thomas had built a new deck overlooking the fields, installed outdoor seating areas, and created walking paths through the property. Their first guests had been a young couple from the city who needed a quiet place to plan their wedding. They'd spent the weekend walking through the fields, sitting on the porch reading books, and talking about their future. When they left, they'd booked another weekend for the following month. "This place is magical," the bride-to-be had told Elena. "It's exactly what we needed." Word spread quickly through social media and online reviews. The Morrison Homestead, as they'd decided to call it, began attracting guests who were looking for exactly what Thomas and Elena could provide: genuine peace, beautiful surroundings, and hosts who cared about creating a meaningful experience. Writers came to work on novels in the quiet study that Elena had created in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Artists came to paint landscapes they couldn't find in the city. Stressed executives came to disconnect from their phones and remember what silence sounded like. Families came to show their children what life was like before screens dominated everything. Thomas had never imagined that his years of watching over the empty house had been preparing him for this. He knew every inch of the property, every seasonal change, every sound and sight that made the homestead special. He could recommend the best spots for watching sunrises, the trails where guests were most likely to see deer, and the perfect places to sit with a cup of coffee on quiet mornings. Elena had discovered that her skills as a nurse translated perfectly to being a host. She was naturally caring and attentive, always noticing when guests needed something before they had to ask. She'd learned to make incredible breakfasts using ingredients from the garden she'd planted behind the house, and she had a gift for making people feel welcome and comfortable. "You two have created something really special here," one guest had told them during a busy weekend in late spring. "It's not just a place to stay, it's a place to remember what matters." The success of their business had surprised them both. They'd expected to struggle for the first year, maybe break even if they were lucky. Instead, they were booked solid most weekends and had regular guests who returned every few months. The income was enough to cover their expenses and put money aside for future improvements, but the financial success wasn't what made Thomas happiest. It was the life they'd built together that felt like the real achievement. They'd created a partnership that worked in every way that mattered. They shared the work, the decisions, the profits, and the satisfaction of building something meaningful. Their relationship had evolved naturally from friendship to something deeper. They'd been through the stress of renovation, the uncertainty of starting a business, and the daily challenges of working closely together. Through it all, they'd supported each other, trusted each other, and found that their different strengths made them better together than apart. "I never thought I'd be this happy," Elena had told Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset after their last guests of the weekend had checked out. I spent so many years being afraid, feeling trapped, thinking I'd never have a real home again. Thomas had understood exactly what she meant. His old life had felt like he was just going through the motions, waiting for something to change. Now, every day brought new challenges, new guests, new reasons to feel proud of what they'd accomplished. The homestead had become more than just a business or a house. It was a place where people came to find peace, where stressed city dwellers could remember what quiet sounded like, where couples could reconnect without distractions, where families could spend time together without screens and schedules dominating their lives. Thomas still walked the property every evening, but now it wasn't the lonely patrol of a night watchman. He was checking on their guests, making sure everyone had what they needed, and taking care of the land that had become his true home. Sometimes Elena would walk with him, and they'd plan improvements, discuss upcoming bookings, or just enjoy the peaceful end to another successful day. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Elena had asked him recently. Thomas had considered the question. Seriously. He'd given up his simple routine of reading books alone on the porch, traded his quiet solitude for the bustle of running a business, and taken on responsibilities he'd never imagined he'd want. "No," he'd answered honestly. "I thought I was happy before, but I was just comfortable. This is different. This is actually living." Elena had smiled, the same radiant smile she'd given him the night she'd proposed buying the homestead together. "I feel the same way." As Thomas stood on the porch now, watching the sun set over the fields they'd turned into walking paths, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, he'd been a lonely man reading books in an empty house, convinced that his best days were behind him. Tonight he was a successful business owner, a trusted partner, and a man who woke up every morning excited about the day ahead. The sound of a car on the gravel road made him look up. Their next guests were arriving, a family with 2 young children, who were taking their first vacation away from the city. Thomas smiled as he walked down the porch steps to greet them, knowing that Elena would be coming out of the kitchen any moment with fresh cookies and her warm welcome. It was funny how life works sometimes. The knock on the door that had seemed like an interruption to his quiet routine had actually been an invitation to a life he'd never dared to imagine. Thomas had learned that sometimes the best things happen when you open your door to unexpected possibilities, and that the most important changes often come disguised as ordinary moments on ordinary nights. As he helped the family unload their luggage, Thomas caught sight of Elena through the kitchen window, already preparing something special for their new guests. He realized that he'd found everything he'd been searching for without even knowing he was looking for it: a purpose, a partner, a home, and a future full of possibilities.